Hi, John. How are you?
Hi there. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
Good that you are already here. Okay. 1 minute. I think we gonna start our. Thank you so much for your coming here. How to call your name, John or Charles or Ryan? Maybe.
John is fine. That's
Oh,
my
John
first
is
name.
fine.
That's no
Okay.
problem.
Good
Yes.
then.
And can I just check that my audio is clear? My audio?
Um, I think it's clear enough from my side, but I don't know from other side, from the organizer. Uh, do you
Testing
hear,
audio. Testing
John?
audio.
Uh-huh.
Do you hear me?
Yes, it's clear, sir.
Moderator?
Yes, it's clear.
It's clear. Okay, good then.
Okay, great. Yes.
Great. Yep. 3 p.m. Yeah, you can start maybe MC or okay, thank you so much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Greetings of peace to all of us. Halo, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan, Rahayu. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar, Hydro and Phyto Poetics.
Honorable Dr. Pil Muhammad Rakib MA as the Lecturer of Indonesian Literature. Honorable Dr. Andes Parmin M. as the Head of Indonesian Literature Study Program. Honorable Mr. Shafiul Anam, Ph.D., Dean of the Faculty of Language and Arts, State University of Surabaya. Also, organizing committee and all participants joining us today.
Let us give thanks to Almighty God for His blessing that allow us to gather virtually in this meaningful event. Today's webinar carries the theme Hydro and Phyto Poetics.
This term reminds us that literature and nature are intertwined, both speak in the language of life. Let us introduce ourselves. I am Jasmine Belfast and this is my partner,
Nirmanda Putri.
We will guide you throughout the event.
Before we start, let's lift our spirit with our special slogan. When we say Hydro and Phyto Poetics, you answer, grow with poems, flow with melody. Let's try it together. 1, 2, 3.
Hydro and Phyto Poetics, grow with poems, flow with melody. We kindly ask all participants to please turn on your cameras during the event. Use the official virtual background provided by the committee and rename your Zoom name with the format name_university or institution. For example, Jasmine Belfast _ State University of Surabaya.
Dear participant, let us now sing national anthem Indonesia Raya, followed by Mars Unesa. To the operator, please proceed.
Indonesia tanah airku, tanah tumpah darahku, di sanalah ku berdiri. dilaksanakan tridharma. Unggul berprestasi, karya inovatif, olahraga, ilmu dan seni. Inklusif, adaptif, kolaboratif, untuk kejayaan negeri. Dalam tempat kamu raih cita-citamu, berani jujur dan tekun, jaga persatuan keluarga, lakukan jiwamu untuk Indonesia sang melangkah di depan. Dalam tempat kamu raih cita-citamu, berani jujur dan tekun, jaga persatuan keluarga, lakukan jiwamu untuk Indonesia sang melangkah di depan.
The agenda for today's event is as follows. First, opening. Second, singing national anthems Indonesia Raya and Mars Unesa. Third, welcoming speeches from head of the committee, lecture of Indonesian literature, then of the faculty. Fourth, reading the speaker's curriculum vitae. Fifth, presentation session. Sixth, discussion and Q&A. 7. Documentation and closing.
Now, let us hear the welcoming speech from the head of the organizing committee. To M. Aufal Marom Muafi, the time and screen are yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Good afternoon and welcome to our special international guest lecture webinar with the theme Hydro and Phyto Poetics in Literary Studies. We are so happy and honored to see so many of you here today as we gather today about a beautiful and interesting topic, how we can see the beauty.
Baik, duluan ya. Iya.
We are incredibly lucky to have with us a very knowledgeable guest lecturer, Mr. John Charles Ryan, Ph.D. from University of Notre Dame, Australia, who has kindly agreed to share his knowledge and wonderful ideas with all of us today. And we are truly grateful for his time and generosity. This event is also a success because of the strong support from our academic family. So we would like to sincerely thank the head of our study program, Mr. Dr. Andes Parmin M. Hum, for his continuous encouragement, our TPA, Mr. Dr. Phil Muhammad Rokib MA, for his valuable guidance, and our Dean, Mr. Shafiul Anam PhD, for his leadership and for always supporting new and creative ideas like this one. To all of you who have joined us online, your presence is what makes this event meaningful, and we thank you for your time and interest. Okay, I think that's all. Thanks for the attention, and please enjoy our webinar today. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan, Rahayu.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for the warm and enthusiastic speech. Next, we will listen to Dr. Phil Muhammad Rokib MA as the lecturer of Indonesian Literature. Sir, please kindly deliver your speech.
Thank you so much, Master of Ceremony. Okay, do you hear my voice clearly or?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. As a teacher, as a lecturer, we would like to warmly welcome Dr. John Charles Ryan And also, I see here our coordinator of the Indonesian Literature Program, Dr. Andes Parmin, and the Dean of Faculty of Language and Arts, Universitas Negeri Surabaya, and of course, all lecturers, students, and participants joining us from, I think, from various places. And of course, all the organizing committee members who already joined here and who have worked hard to make today's event possible. Thank you so much for all. And today we gather in this academic space to explore, in my opinion, it's a beautiful and meaningful theme. And it's inspired by John's article, yeah, Hydro and also Phyto Poetics in Literary Studies. And I read the article, both article Phyto and also hydropoetic, and John have already sent the article to us, yeah, to the student, and thank you so much for that. And this theme reminds us that literature does not only speak about humans, but also, yeah, about all living beings around us, about flowing water, rooted plants, about the deep connection between nature and human imagination. Through this guest lecture, we hope to broaden our understanding of the term is it's common right now, eco-poetics, and to realize how literature can be bridged to ecological awareness. We also hope that this event will inspire more scholar, more student, or in the future become scholars. I hope more scholar and student to pay attention to environmental issues and to see literature as a creative way to reflect, care, and take responsibility for our planets. Yeah. We sincerely thanks to Dr. John Charles Ryan, Mr. John, for sharing his thought, his insight, his inspiration to everyone who contributed to the success of this event. Yeah, may today's session be a source of new ideas, deeper understanding, and probably a collaboration for a better and more sustainable world. Let us enjoy this session together and let the flow of ideas and the growth of knowledge be like water and plants, always moving, always growing, and always bridging life. Thank you so much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for your inspiring words. Now, let us hear the speech from the Dean of the Faculty of Language and Arts, Mr. Shafiul Anam, Ph.D. The time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera bagi kita semuanya. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, Rahayu. Yang saya hormati Dr. John Charles Ryan sebagai narasumber kita pada pagi hari ini, Bapak Korprodi S1 Sastra Indonesia, Pak Jack Parmin, seluruh Bapak Ibu dosen S1 Sastra Indonesia, semua mahasiswa angkatan 2024 dari Sastra Indonesia selaku penyelenggara, dan juga semua peserta webinar pada pagi hari ini. Pertama-tama, marilah kita panjatkan puja dan puji syukur dari Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, karena atas rahmat dan karunia-Nya kita dapat berkumpul di ruang maya dalam kondisi sehat walafiat di acara International Guest Lecture dengan tema yang sangat inspiratif, Hydro and Phyto Poetics. Sebagai Dekan Fakultas Bahasa dan Seni, saya menyampaikan apresiasi setinggi-tingginya kepada mahasiswa sastra Indonesia angkatan 2024. Inisiatif, kreatif, dan kerja keras Anda semuanya dalam menyelenggarakan acara yang luar biasa di hari ini, serta mampu menjalin kolaborasi dengan akademisi internasional, ini adalah bukti nyata dari semangat kepemimpinan dan intelektualitas Anda. Acara ini bukan hanya sebuah prestasi, tapi juga sebuah kontribusi bermakna bagi hazanah keilmuan di fakultas kita. Oleh karena itu, saya ucapkan terima kasih atas dedikasi Anda semuanya. To Dr. Ryan, thank you very much for your time, for sharing your insight with our students. It is a tremendous honor and also blessing for us. Bapak, Ibu, dan saudara-saudara semuanya, tema yang diusung hari ini di International Guest Lecture, yaitu Hydro and Phyto Poetics, sungguh sangat urgen dan juga relevan, khususnya di Indonesia yang sekarang juga sangat concern terkait dengan SDGs. Di tengah tantangan krisis ekologi, kita memerlukan sebuah bahasa baru atau mungkin mengingatkan kembali bahasa yang lama yang mampu menjembatani jurang pemisah antara manusia dan alam. Hydro Poetics mengajak kita menyelami kelenturan, kedalaman, dan siklus air sebagai metafora kehidupan. Sementara Phyto Poetics mengajak kita belajar dari ketahanan pertumbuhan dan jaring komunitas tumbuhan. Oleh karena itu, webinar hari ini lebih dari sekedar kuliah biasa. Ini adalah undangan untuk refleksi, untuk mengasah kepekaan, dan untuk menemukan kembali posisi kita sebagai bagian dari alam, bukan sebagai penguasanya. Saya berharap dari diskusi kita di hari ini akan lahir bukan hanya pemahaman akademis yang lebih dalam, tetapi juga inspirasi untuk menciptakan karya sastra yang berpihak pada kehidupan dan keberlanjutan. Akhir kata, kepada seluruh peserta International Guest Lecture hari ini, mari kita manfaatkan kesempatan langka ini dengan sebaik-baiknya. Berpartisipasilah secara aktif, ajukan pertanyaan-pertanyaan kritis, dan engage dalam kegiatan ini sampai selesai. Oleh karena itu, saya nyatakan International Guest Lecture dengan tema Hydro and Phyto Poetics dibuka. Selamat mengikuti acara. Semoga kita semuanya mendapatkan inspirasi dan pencerahan yang berharga. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for your thoughtful and encouraging message.
Before we move on to the main presentation, let us first get to know more about our honorable speaker through the reading of the curriculum vitae. It's important for us to see the outstanding background and achievement that will surely inspire all of us.
So, it is my honor to read the curriculum vitae of our speaker, highlighting their academic achievements and contributions. John Charles Ryan, Ph.D., is an international researcher in literary studies, creative writing, and environmental humanities, who is based in Bhutan as Associate Professor of Creative Writing at Royal Thimphu College. Ryan also served as Adjunct Senior Research Fellow at the Nulungu Institute, University of Notre Dame, Australia, and visiting researcher at the Arctic Center, University of Lapland, Finland. His body of published work comprises 19 academic books, authored and edited, 55 book chapters, 100 referred journal articles, 21 referred conference publications, 113 conference presentations, and more than 100 poems. Ryan's books include Plants in Contemporary Poetry, Eco-criticism, and the Botanical Imagination, Routledge, and Introduction to the Environmental Humanities, Routledge and co-author. Funded by the Cornell Foundation, his current research examines possibilities for human-tree collaboration in northern Finland. He is chief editor of the journal Plant Perspective and managing co-editor of the Tramter. For further information, can visit to his archive at www.charlesryan.com.
Now we have learned more about our speaker's journey and academic contribution, which prove all that we already with a great people. This session will be guided by our moderator, who will lead us through the presentation and discussion. Please give your best attention as we begin this insightful session. To our moderator, Fairuz Hanum, the time and screen are yours.
Okay, thank you, Jasmine. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan, Rahayu, Rahayu, Rahayu. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you myself. My name is Fairuz Hanum Kus Ali Darajati. You can call me Fairuz. And today, I'll be your moderator for diving deeper to what is hydro and phytopoetics with Mr. John Charles Ryan. Before we listen to Mr. John's presentation, let me introduce you the intermezzo of hydro and phytopoetics. Intermezzo of hydro and phytopoetics. What is hydro and phytopoetics? Let's meet hydro and phytopoetics. Both of those are systems that are based on arts, which are implying plants and water as the sources of ecological systems that aspire to be poetics. Poetics itself is a term that contains a meaning of literature, arts, and many more. This kinds of poetics brings another level of emotions by implying from plants and water around us. What is hydropoetics? Hydropoetics is an interdisciplinary poetics that approaches humanities' interaction with water systems through creative and artistic expressions, which are also commonly known as hydropoetics. This methodology provides means for communicating the inherent value of water, its ecological fragility, and the necessity for diligent stewardship. The practice seeks to enhance public comprehension and relationship with aquatic environments, transforming intricate hydrological concepts into approachable, emotionally impactful experiences, sourced from Sustainability Directorate. Then, what is phytopoetics? Phytopoetics is a new form of art that describes the impact of plants on the human mind and imagination that is evident in both artworks and shifting cultural currents. Poetics, derived from the Greek term poiesis, or making, describes the rules of writing. So, it makes phytopoetics stands for the co-creation of literature with plants. In other words, it shows how plants impact human thought and writing to co-create culture phytopoetically. Charlie Jacobs, 2024. It brings us to conclusion that hydro and phytopoetics are new forms of poetics to express our creativity to arts that are inspired by water and plants. These poetic systems are created to express our feelings that are depicted by the influence of nature, which each have their own example, such as hydroponics, which are inspired by hydropoetics, or the value of water, and phytopoetics, which are inspired by plants. In other words, water and plants can be our sources to both live and create poetics from the very source itself. Striving to ages for seeking answers, now we're here waiting for explanations. Now, let me representing to you Mr. John Charles Ryan, Ph.D., to be our main presenter for hydro and phytopoetics. Mr. John, the stage and screens are yours.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. And may I just check that I'm audible? Is my sound
Yes.
clear?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay, very good. If there's any distortion in my sound, don't hesitate to let me know, and I will try to adjust. I'm calling in from Bhutan, and as you know, Bhutan is a very mountainous country. Uh, so occasionally the telecommunication signals can be interrupted. So I will do my best. And thank you so much for joining me today. I'm delighted that so many of you have gathered here today to hear about phytopoetics and hydropoetics. What I will do is reduce my bandwidth consumption by turning off my video, and I'll now screen share my slides with you. Okay, everyone, very pleased to join you. And once again, if there's any distortion, dear moderator, please just let me know. So selamat siang, semua. I'm delighted to join you. I spent many months in Surabaya at Untag, your fellow university. And in fact, this was during the pandemic time. Selamat siang, yes. Hello, everyone. It was during the pandemic time. And so I ended up spending a long period in Indonesia, first in Surabaya, and then in Malang, and then in Bali during 2020 and 2021, your city. And I'm always very happy to speak with Indonesian students and researchers. I have a fondness for Indonesia, and I think over the course of my life, I've spent more than 2 years living in various parts of Indonesia. So very happy to join you today. Okay, so our subject is phytopoetics and hydropoetics in literary studies. And I would like to open with this image, these three images from a recent work that's called Microcosms. And if you look into the Zoom chat, you'll see a URL link to the Microcosms project. In fact, the book has just been published, and it's a very interesting example of phytopoetics. I'll talk a bit more about microcosms during the presentation, but I want to stress here that phytopoetics does not necessarily need to relate to poetry or literature. It can relate to images, it can relate to cultural productions, it can relate to social and community initiatives. They all can have a phytopoetic dimension. So let us carry on. And so, phytopoetics and hydropoetics. Now, I've supplied the slides as a PDF, and you may like to review this after the seminar, but I'd like to give you a structure for thinking about phytopoetics and hydropoetics. And I'm going to use literature as the example. Once again, phytopoetics can be about literature, but it can also be about art. It can be about community initiatives. It can be about conservation and many, many other creative plants in literature is an area of literary studies that I specialize in. And in the study of plants in literature, we can talk about plant texts. Eco-criticism has about a 30-year history, and early eco-criticism, as the study of literature and environment, discussed environmental texts. So in plants and literature, we can discuss plant texts. And plant texts are those texts that represent plant life and human flora relations. Now, a plant text could be a poem, it could be a dramatic script, it could be a piece of social media. You could even argue from a pop cultural perspective, plant text could be graffiti. Plant text could even be the kinds of writings that plants themselves do. If you've ever looked at an old tree and seen the various contours that beetles may carve into the old bark, you will have an idea of what I mean. Plants' life, and especially trees, they have their own kind of textuality. Okay, so we can talk about plant texts. Following that, we can then think about phytocriticism. Phytocriticism is an extension of eco-criticism that focuses in on reading literary cultural texts through a plant-attuned lens. You can read any work of literature or culture from a plant perspective. You could read Shakespeare for its references to flowers, for his references to flowers. You could read a Korean trendy pop type of series from a phytocritical perspective, because maybe there aren't wild plants, but there may in fact be potted plants in these highly urban sort of texts. So phytocriticism examines our relationship to the plant world. Now, phytopoetics, the subject of our discussion today, is any kind of creative expression, any kind of so-called making, including poetry, but not limited to poetry. Any creative as its focal point. Phytopoetics refers to writing that's very keenly interested in the plant world and very keenly interested in plant conservation. But phytopoetics could also refer to an urban gardening initiative that uses some really interesting sustainable mechanisms to work with plants in the urban environment. So phytopoetics is any kind of creative expression that attempts to partner with the botanical world. Now, the broader context for these ideas are these two fields that I'll mention to you. The first is called human plant studies, and the second is called the plant humanities. These are broad interdisciplinary fields that attempt to study plants from multiple perspectives, including scientific, but also social, scientific, and humanistic, and even arts-based approaches to studying plants and human relationships to plants. Now, so we've covered this framework with relation to plants. Let's look at water, and it follows in the same way, parallel. So we can think of hydrotext as those texts, and remember that includes everything from poetry and novels to media forms and graffiti, pop cultural forms. Text is the word text is very broadly defined, especially from a cultural studies perspective. Any text that represents our water bodies, an ocean, a lake, a river, and our relationship to water as users of water, as beings who also conserve water, yet also impact water by polluting it and draining it. Hydrocriticism is then a critical approach to reading text. I added literary text here, but once again, it could be any kind of text, including a pop cultural text, reading a text through a water-focused lens. So what does a Shakespearean sonnet tell us about human relationships to water during the era? What does a poem by Taufik Ismail, the famous Indonesian poet, what does a poem by Tawfiq Ismail tell us about our relationship to water and to water conservation? Right? These are the kinds of questions that you can ask. Hydropoetics is then any kind of creative expression that engages with the water, the world of water, the hydrological world as its focal point. So it could be poetry that's very deeply concerned with water, but it could also be a kind of community initiative that's all about conserving water, reducing waste around water, and so forth. So these kinds of creative expressions of various kinds can have a hydropoetic quality, because we have to bear in mind that the term poetics comes from the Greek term poiesis, which is a making, any kind of making, whether it's a making of a poem, the making of a restored environment, the making of a new community that has awareness of water and plants as its basis. And then more broadly speaking, we can connect to the framework of the blue humanities, which attempts once again to study water from a varied interdisciplinary spectrum of approaches. Okay, so that is a framework that we can keep in mind as we navigate these ideas of hydropoetics and phytopoetics. So look at the image that's on the screen. This is from 1869. It's a Japanese artwork and hydropoetically. Specifically, we're looking for relationships between people and plants and people in water that are marked by evolution and transformation. So, simply put, as a plant grows and matures and changes over the season, so do human beings. There's a connection that's implicated with transformation over time and growth over time, as being from the perspective of our deep connection with plants, plants as healing agents, plants as food, plants as spiritual human beings. They offer us materials to live. They also inspire us. They inspire our identity. They help to create our communities. They help to forge our cultural heritage. And so if we look closely at the image, we find cedars, for example, so there's and the shrine, right? So in this case, the trees have this religious and spiritual significance. Okay, so what is
Excuse me, Mr. John.
poetic?
I'm sorry, sir. Your voice.
I think as
Didn't
our
really
excellent
clear.
introduction, excellent moderator, that framework of thinking.
Hello, Mr. John.
Okay, is it clear now? Or
No, still not clear. Your the music is still loud and your voice
patchy?
isn't really clear.
Yes, hello. Yes. Okay, can you hear me me now? Is it clear now?
Still not yet, sir. I'm really sorry. Maybe because of the music.
Yes.
Okay, your voice is loud and clear now.
Okay, I do apologize for that.
Yes.
So
Thank you, sir.
let's carry on. I'll try a different network then. Once again, connection can be unstable here in Bhutan. Okay, so phytopoetics is a theoretical framework. And let me just make sure I'm sharing my screen again. Okay. Okay, great. And please just let me know if my voice is unclear or if the screen is unclear. So we'll carry on. Phytopoetics is a theoretical framework, and it calls attention to any kind of creative work that focuses A, on the botanical world, B, the lives that plants lead. And of course, ecology tells us a lot about the lives that plants lead. They have their own kind of internal lives, right? Often out of view of us. C, human flora and fauna relations, and D, threats to the future of plant life. So when we talk about hydropoetics, once again, we don't only mean poetry. We can mean any kind of activity that attempts to align or engage with the wisdom of plants. You could talk about a social activity to create a community garden in Surabaya that has a phytopoetic element, insofar as it attempts to align with the wisdom of plants, with the intelligence of plants. So in that respect, phytopoetics aims to bring the human imagination into dialogue with the wisdom of plants. And so what do we mean by the wisdom of plants? Right. So I'll discuss that in a moment. So there are two kind of points that I want to impart to you about phytopoetics. In one respect, it does refer to poetry that takes the botanical world as its focal point. And so you could look at the poems of Taufik Ismail, you could look at other Indonesian poets, and you could develop a phytopoetic reading of the poetry. Now, this kind of poetry might often include knowledge about human-plant relationships. So, for example, in Indonesia, the banyan tree is very important. So if the poem discusses the sacred significance of the banyan tree amongst Javanese culture, it's capturing biocultural knowledge. Many of these kinds of poems will discuss the names of plants. These poems will often refer to the common names, let's say the Javanese names, the Bahasa Indonesian names, the English names, and the scientific names, for example, right? So names are a very important part of phytopoetics. Speaking modes. In some poems, the perspective is presented from that of the plant. So the plant is a kind of speaker in the poem. So that is also another dimension of phytopoetics. It experiments with speaking modes. And the fourth aspect under poetry is that the form of the poem can often evoke the structure of the plant or the form of the plant. They mirror one another. So the form of the plant mirrors the form of the text. Okay. So those are 4 points about phytopoetics as poetry. But remember, phytopoetics is more than poetry. It is, at its most general, a human worldview that seeks to benefit from and engage with the wisdom of plants. Plants have their own kind of intelligence. One way to describe that intelligence is as a systems intelligence, or what we might call embodied cognition. Plants live in communal systems. They may be individuals, but they're deeply connected. If we think of one tree, it's in fact connected to many other trees and many other life forms, right? And so plants demand that we think of intelligence as systematic or systemic, as connected, implicated with systems, specifically ecosystems. Plants have an ability to stay still, yet remain alert. And we can call this percipient cecility, or even alert repose. What this means is simply that as they are relatively fixed in place, they are still incredibly alert. They are still perceiving the world around them and observing them. We've all perhaps heard of this metaphor of the wallflower, right? The person at a party who stands at the wall aside from the group. It doesn't mingle, but just observes the group. Plants are very much like that, although they're also participating in their own plant party. Heterotemporality. Plants demand that we think of time differently. We often, in the Western worldview, or the westernized worldview of time, it's a linear progression, typically, from historical past, the present, to the future, right? But the idea of heterotemporality suggests that multiple times can exist within one moment. So we can have multiple time scales. We can have a cyclical kind of time at work. And plants affirm that there are different kinds of time, different forms of temporality at work in the world. Plants have different languages. They use chemicals, they use sounds, they use various signals to communicate. Plants are self-regenerating. So if you chop off a leaf from a particular shrub, sometimes that shrub will grow back better. It will grow back more vigorously because it's been cut. Now, if we do that with an animal, it will seriously jeopardize the health and well-being of the animal, including the human. The plants are self-regenerating. Plants have beauty, but that beauty is connected to their ecology. So when we think of flowers, they're visually beautiful, but they're connected to an ecology, to survival, to pollination. Phytopoetics therefore demands that we think of language differently, that we think of language as more than the representation of the world, as an objective account of the world. It demands that we think of language as having the capacity for what I call intermediation. Language as intermediation means that language is a dialogue between beings. And a form of phytopoetics, whether it's a poem, a novel, a dance script, a film, a community initiative, a community garden, these are forms of intermediation between the plant world, the human world, and all other non-human worlds, right? So language is woven with the fabric of the world rather than an objective representation of the world. So keep that in mind, the difference between representation and intermediation. Okay, well, let's look at some examples then of phytopoetics. And the one that I often revert to is the work of Louise Gluck. Louise Gluck was an American poet, and she wrote an entire collection called The Wild Iris, which is the plant featured on your screen. And the Wild Iris had this collection won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992 or 3. And the entire collection is about garden plants. In many of the poems, the plants are speaking back in these various kinds of voices. So the Wild Iris in the collection has a kind of defiant voice, right? A very defiant voice. And so in some of the poems, plants are kind of mournful, right? And so there's a line from one of the poems, and I'll quote, this is the plant speaking. It is terrible to survive as consciousness buried in the dark earth, right? It is terrible to survive as consciousness buried in the dark earth. This line is being spoken by the wild iris, and if we investigate this plant, we know that over the wintertime in the northern hemisphere, it dies back and it survives as a bulb underground, a mass underground. So during the winter, it's awaiting the spring, right? So she's saying, the poet is saying, through the perspective of the plant, that the wild iris retains its consciousness through the winter. It is basically an intelligent being. It has the capacity for memory. Another poet you could read Phyto Poetically is Ted Hughes, the famous British poet. This is a poem from 1973 called Fern, and this is the fern featured on the screen, not necessarily the subject of Hughes' poem, but an example of fern. And the poem begins with a simple phrase, here is the fern's frond. So we can see that the poem is written more from the third person perspective. And then the poet proceeds to describe the fern dynamism, right? So unfurling a gesture, that's one phrase from the poem. And so unfurling a gesture, so the plant has this ability to communicate, right? This is my own poem called Rock Orchid Hyphae. And this is a poem in which the form of the poem is meant to mirror the form of the orchid's interior. Now, inside the orchid, there are little strands called hyphae. They're kind of like filaments. And these strands help in communication between the various internal systems of the orchid and its environment. And so the lines of the poem reach across to one another, much like the filaments of the orchid, these little hyphae filaments, reach across to one another as they're communicating. And so it's my visualization of the inside, the microscopic interior of the orchid as a kind of communication nexus. I certainly won't read that, that's quite long. And another example of phytopoetics is this. This is the project that I showed you at the beginning. This is called Microcosms. And this is a partnership between, or a collaboration between a plant cultural historian and a plant scientist. And this kind of visualization is created by a technical process called confocal microscopy, And so the idea was to visualize the interiors of these sacred plants. These are plants sacred to North and South American peoples, sacred as medicines, as totems, in many other ways. And so the scientists and the cultural historian helped or partnered together to visualize the interior structures of these plants. And we can see that the structures are very artistic, right? They look like paintings in themselves, but these are the actual interior structures of the species. So that's a kind of phytopoetics. Let's turn to hydropoetics. And I want to focus in on indigenous hydropoetics, because it's an important subject for me and for the study of Australian poetry, and also for my interest in Indonesian poetry. Now, phytopoetics, hydropoetics, once again, is about any kind of creative expression that engages meaningfully with water, water as an intelligent agent, water as a dynamic subject, if you will. If we think of indigenous hydropoetics, we add the knowledge systems of indigenous peoples. And so an indigenous hydropoetics is about embodied relations to water based on ancestral narratives and knowledge, indigenous narratives and knowledge. These types of poetics recognize the agency of water. They acknowledge the ways that water communicates to us. They invite us to open ourselves to those forms of communication. These hydropoetics attempt to attune to the transformation of water over time and seasons. So in the case of poetry, remember, hydropoetics is more than poetry, but I use poetry as an example because poesis, poetics, and poetry, right? So we're using poetry as an example, but any kind of creative expression can be one of hydropoetics. Hydropoetic works confer respect to water as a fellow being. And hydropoetics tend to counter what we could call paracentrism, which is the privileging of water, of the earth, of the terrestrial over the aquatic. Now, conservation sometimes is what we call paracentric. Conservation may, in some cases, give a privileging to the terrestrial over the aquatic. So it's something in our psyche, maybe, that we're earthbound beings. We don't live in water, so we tend to privilege the earth, right? You can say that works of hydropoetics also embrace hydrocentrism and hydrophilia, the love of water. Are you a hydrophilic person? Do you love water, right? Are you a hydrocentric water person? Do you want to live near water, right? So these are some of the precepts and principles of hydropoetics. A few examples for you before we turn to Indonesia. This is the Brisbane River in Australia. And one indigenous Australian writer who's written extensively about this river is known as Samuel Wagon Watson. Okay, and so water, of course, and this river in particular, is very important to indigenous people. And there are all kinds of creation stories about the river amongst the indigenous people of the Brisbane area. And so in his work, Samuel Wagon Watson invokes lots of these indigenous hydropoetic views of rivers. So for example, one of the creation stories about the Brisbane River is that there was a rainbow serpent who created the river during the dream time. Right? The dream time is that ancient era when all life came into existence, all things came into existence. And in this narrative, this rainbow serpent becomes stuck as she travels up a dry creek. So she appeals to Yara, the rain being, and Nyalang, the cloud being, for assistance. These two ancestral beings bring about a thunderous rain that washes under the belly of the serpent being, enabling the being to squirm free from the creek bed. And as the serpent being writhed her way through the landscape, she created the Brisbane River. Okay, so the river was created through the activities of these ancestral beings. And so a work such as Samuel Wagon Watson's captures this hydropoetics. Remember, hydropoetics is about transformation, and specifically co-transformation between beings, right? And we find this so evidently in creation stories of indigenous people. And this is transferred also, it's conveyed into indigenous poets of the contemporary era as well, their work. So Samuel Wagon Watson has written lots of poems about the river, and this is an example, Poetry on the Green Bridge. Okay, and we can see like the second part of the poem there, Dreaming River Triptych, never the same this river, archaic vein, snaking through the lands, dreaming cortex, submerging provinces, the past, present, and future, an aquarelle triptych cultured on every side, right? So there's the never the same, this river, right? Never the same. It's constantly in a mode of transformation. All right, so that's a hydropoetics that engages with the wisdom of rivers, and that also recognizes the transformation that people undergo in relation to rivers. Culture people undergo personally, spiritually, and psychologically, and physically, of course. All right, I'm going to just fast forward this a little past. This is the work of Janine Lean, who's a very interesting Indigenous poet from New South Wales. If you're looking for a subject for a research project on Indigenous Australian poetry, her work is a great example. So I'll just mention her work, but I want to conclude with the connection between Australia and Indonesia. Now, interestingly, if we look at this image, this connection occurs physically through this engineering feat, which is the Broome-Pajava telegraph cable. Broome is in Western Australia, and so this is a 1,650 kilometer long submarine cable that provided a link to Australia, between Australia and Java in 1889. Can you imagine that? A cable in 1889 linking Indonesia and Australia, 1,650 kilometers long. How did they do it? It's astonishing, right? So we can think about that cable as a kind of metaphor for the kind of work that can be done between continents and cultures and landscapes, right? So we could develop a comparative hydropoetics between, let's say, Indigenous Australian cultures and Javanese cultures, for example. All right. Okay, so here is a site that may be familiar to you. This is Kali Jagir, which is one of the tributaries of the Mas River, or the Kali Mas, which means golden river in Javanese. This is a river that I frequented when I stayed in Surabaya. And due to pollution, the Jagir River has become turbid, has become very unclear, and the city has started to clean up the river. And now, when I stayed in Surabaya, there was talk amongst fishermen that of catching drunk fish, what they call drunk fish. So every few months, sludge disposal, or what they call flushing, into the Kali Jagir causes the fish, shrimp, and other freshwater species to get quote unquote drunk. This is the word that the people use. So the surrounding community members would catch these drunk fish without any trouble using traditional nets. So these were intoxicated fish, intoxicated by the chemicals leaching into the river. I found that interesting, but also quite troubling as far as the humans, fishermen, are consuming these contaminated fish. So along the Kali Jagir, there's a bridge known as pronunciation, or Green Bridge. And according to the Serbian mythologies, many spirits in the form of white crocodiles or white oyo swim or once swam under the oyo bridge, right? So it's an actual bridge, but it also has a basis in mythology as well, which is quite interesting. Now, the savior, as I understand, called Hug, and he was the protector of Kali Jagir and Kali Mas, especially around the mangroves at Wonokromo. Now, if someone was swept away in the Kali Jagir and the Kali Mas, he or she could be saved by the hero, by Puck Hug. And the protective spirit, who had the ability to dive for hours and command all the crocodiles and other spirits in the river. This protective spirit had that ability. In searching for missing people, Puck Hug called upon the assistance of crocodiles and spirits. And so we see how these ancient mythologies of the river connect with the idea of hydropoetics as transformation. Central to these mythologies, these stories, these tales, is a deep sense of transformation, that the river is not a static entity, that the river is an intelligent, dynamic system. And we find that in these stories, whether Indigenous Australian or Javanese. And that's why they give us an appreciation, these narratives give us an appreciation of rivers as dynamically transformative. Now, if you're doing any kind of river research, from any disciplinary perspective, it's always very interesting to look at archival photographs. So here is some images of the river, the old wooden canoes. I'm sure you have a proper name for those vessels, and some of the early commerce that occurred along the river. Very interesting to compare these historic representations to the current images of the river. You can see that this is, I believe, the same bridge and some of the early construction and the vegetation that was along the river. Okay, now that brings us to the end, and that brings us to the work of F. Aziz Mana, Mentor for Attacking the City. I believe that this is a hydropoetic and a phytopoetic work. Insofar as it intrinsic to this work by F. Aziz Mana is a deep concern for the plants and the water of the city, okay, of the urban environment. And so we can read, and I won't read this entire poem, but this is a poem called Estuary. And I'll just read the introductory lines. More destructive than fire, oil swallows our home, ash thickens into black stains, enlarging and expanding an estuary of silence in a veil of supreme darkness. Above the black swamp, a wind dances with smoke, bushes grow wild on the dike, covering our tracks, etc., etc. Essential to this poem is the dynamism of the estuary, enlarging and expanding. Those gerunds imply activity, ongoing activity, enlarging and expanding. It's not limited to one temporal frame. It's ongoing, an estuary of silence. Yet there's also this impact of the human on the estuary, oil and ash and black stains, right? So an example of a hydropoetics that's deeply concerned with the river as an entity and being impacted by industrial society. And finally, a phytopoetics from the same poet, Elephant Grass. I'll just read the opening lines. The roundabout in the city center is suddenly covered with elephant grass, whose tassels are white, not brown, because of the season, and also because the wind extends their panicles like a funeral shroud, which one night at the base of memory, I heard rip in the sigh of a string of flower blossoms, in the chanting of prayers, in the nodding and drowsiness of all those there who were leaning in one direction and being directed to display the coarse and sharp leaf ribbon, which is probably a sickle that came from the hand of the true architect, or possibly a trainee, cut them to create a resting space on a footpath piled with finger-shaped roots with cement and asphalt, but who stubbornly insisted on storing its whiteness in the depth of the soil's embrace. So you see, I mentioned, I'll read the first line, but the whole poem is one line, right? And this also in itself is important to the phytopoetics. That one long sentence implies a kind of continuous transformation. And we also see reference to the seasons and how the plant changes over the seasons. These kinds of transformations are essential to a phytopoetics. So any kind of creative work that engages with that transformation becomes phytopoetic. And once again, phytopoetics can be poetry, can be a novel, can be literature, but it doesn't need to be. It can be an initiative to restore elephant grass, to restore the river amongst the community. It may have nothing to do with poetry, but it can still be phytopoetic, and in the case of water, hydropoetic. So thank you very much. I'm sorry for any distortion in my sound. I hope you for any questions that you have.
Well, such an amazing explanation. Thank you so much, Mr. John, for explaining it to us. Okay, everyone. Now we arrive at discussion session. For anyone who wants to ask Mr. John a question, you can raise your hand and don't forget to turn on your camera and your microphone. You can tell your name and institution first before asking. So, Mr. John, the participants will ask you some questions, and you can answer it right away or collect all of the questions first, then answer it together.
Great. Happy to read one question we have in the chat. Azhar is a student at UNESA. He's read my writing about hydropoetics of Aboriginal people, the connection between humans and rivers. This is interesting because poetry can be interpreted as a water conservation strategy.
I'm sorry, pardon, sir. Your voice too small.
Okay, reading the question from the chat. So Muhammad Sar is saying that hydropoetics is interesting because it can be interpreted as a water conservation strategy, which is true. Yes, in Indonesia, he seems to have found a similar form, but it is not in the form of poetry, but rather folk tales about lakes. Yeah, how the surrounding community must be protected, must protect water sources, fish sustainably, and not exploit water resources arbitrarily. And this also be considered hydropoetics, or is it called hydrofolklore or something similar? Yeah. Thank you for the question. That's a very good question about the forms that hydropoetics can take. And yes, indeed, those tales, those folk narratives about water that have much to do with protecting water and actually prescribing ways to interact with water and proscribing ways to things to avoid, right? Those are good examples of hydropoetic narratives. So yes, you could certainly argue that these kinds of narratives in Indonesia are forms of hydropoetics, much like the creation stories of the Indigenous Australian people are all about the beings that made the rivers and lakes possible. And implicit to that is protecting and conserving those water bodies. So the narratives are not just about ancient beliefs, they're about contemporary conservation, especially in Australia, that water is so precious and so scarce. These tales, you could call them folk tales, are essential to conservation because they pass intergenerational knowledge of water on. And so they're essential today as essential today as they were in thousands of years or more ago. In the case of Australia, 60,000 years. So yes, Mr. Azhar, those folk narratives are certainly hydropoetic. And thank you for your question. If anyone has other questions, please unmute your mic or feel free to write your question in the chat.
Okay, Mr. Ryan. Firstly, I will tell, I'll be the one who read off the question, and then you can answer it right away. For anyone who wants to ask again, you can raise your hand, and don't forget to turn on your microphone and camera.
Saya bertanya, moderator.
Okay, you can tell your name and which institution.
My name is Andy. Salam kenal, Mr. John.
Hi, sir. Nice to see you in the field.
My name is Andy. I'm lecturer in Indonesian Department, Unesa University. Mr. Rocket is my friend.
Great.
Pak Andi, your voice masih mute Pak Andi. Di unmute. Ya, sip.
Oh yes, my name is Andy, Mr. John. Mr. Rocket is my friend in Indonesian Department. Manda and Yasmin is my student. Saya senang sekali Pak Rokib, mohon nanti ada beberapa yang ditranslatekan Pak Rokib ya. Saya senang sekali with this topic, hydro and politics. I like poetry, Mr. John. Flowers, tree, stone, sky. Nah, I want to send you my poetry with topic hydro and poetics in seperti daun ya, air dan sebagainya. Nah, beberapa minggu ini topik kami berkaitan dengan one student, one tree and one poetry. Saya mewajibkan mahasiswa saya menulis dengan penugasan berbasis project ya, taman puisi. Saya wajibkan satu orang, satu student, one student, one poetry, one tree. Jadi mereka membawa tumbuhan, bunga-bunga ke kampus. Kemudian mereka harus menulis puisi dari pohon atau bunga yang mereka bawa. Nah, dengan proyek seperti ini saya ingin membuat dunia ini penuh dengan oksigen, H2O, H2O, ya, dengan O2, agar bisa melangsungkan kehidupan ini antara seni dan kehidupan. Nah, senang sekali bisa berdiskusi dengan Mr. John. Semoga kita bertemu di kampus. Terima kasih Pak Rokib dan mahasiswa saya yang sangat antusias. Semoga ilmu yang diberikan Mr. John berkah dan menjadi ilmu yang bermanfaat. Terima kasih Pak Rokib.
Terima kasih Pak Andi. Dr. John, do you speak Indonesian by the way?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, then Pak Andi said that he practices in teaching Indonesian literature by experiencing, like making poetry, creating poetry with or accompanying with a plant. I mean, while students creating poetry, they also bring a plant, a flower, and etc. into class, and also express how they feel with the plant. That's Mr. Andy's experience with in his teaching. Yeah, that's the short thing. Yeah.
Great. That's a great way to teach literature and poetry as well. Yeah, fantastic. A phytopoetic teaching approach. Mhm.
And I see there are some questions also in the chat ya.
Pak Rokib, izinkan saya yang membacakan, Pak.
Yep.
Oke, From Kalinsta Putri. Hello, sir. Nice to meet you. My name is Kalinsta. I am a student of Indonesian literature. I am currently working on my thesis using the theory of hydropoetics. A journal I read explains that hydropoetics interprets water in a text. In my research, I read water in the novel Perahu Kertas as an entity that operates at the level of embodiment, relationality, and agency. Methodologically, how can I validate that water still functions as a narrative structure, even though it does not appear in its literal form? And what is the relationship between water or nature and humans? Mr. John, maybe you want to answer it right away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. So you're applying hydropoetics to a novel, Indonesian novel, and you're interested in how the water operates at the level of embodiment, relationality, and agency in the novel. Absolutely, yeah. So methodologically, how can you validate that water still functions as a narrative structure, even though it does not appear in its literal form? Yeah, so this is an important question for all kinds of phytopoetic or hydropoetic works. So for example, if we know that, let's, for example, look at the poet Ted Hughes, the British poet. We know that he loved to what's called fly fish, which is where you stand in the water and cast your pole, and very different to other kinds of fishing called fly fishing. And I think he was very much connected to the river. But only some of his poetry actually deals with water and rivers. But because water was so important to his life, we can read his other poetry as having a water-like quality or hydropoetic quality. I think you could do the same in a novel like this one that you've mentioned, where even though the subject of water is not being addressed directly, there's a water-like quality to the writing. It could be strategies, textual strategies like long sentences. In the poem by F. Aziz Mana, the second one, the poem is one continuous sentence. It flows much like water, even though it talks about plants. It's a very hydropoetic form of writing as well. So I would recommend that you look at the structural elements, the typographical elements, the diction, the phrasing, do a close view. And the question is, how is the writing water-like in its quality? Flow, I mean, water-like has to do with flow. In some cases, the writing may become very flowing and then very stuck. You know, that's a bit like the flowing of a river. We have water that's flowing, then it hits a rock. It becomes, I believe it's called an eddy, right? And then it flows again after it goes around the rock, right? So that's part of your original approach to the text, to identify the water-like qualities of the text, even though it may not be overtly about water. And the second one is, what is the relationship between water or nature and humans? Well, from our perspective, it's a literary relationship. So humans write about water. Water is the subject of their writing, but we are also beings who are deeply interdependent with water. And so those writings become like water in themselves. Right? So look at, as literary students, examine how those texts are water-like. And it's up to you to define the parameters as far as whatever it may be, flowing versus staccato cadence in the text, or long lineation, to short lineation to long lineation, right? This movement back and forth between flow and lack of flow. There could be other water-like qualities in the text. I think that's a good creative question. Okay.
Okay, sir. Let me read the next question. From Ezekiel Arta. Hello, Mr. Ryan. I am Ezekiel. I am a student from UNESA. I am really sorry I can't open my microphone and camera due to my bad connection. As previously explained before, the plant is the focal or main object. But could we still call a literary work is about a person who impact obtaining benefit from plant or water as a hydro or phytopoetic?
Yes, absolutely. It's important to bear in mind the different relationships that we have with plants and also with water. So we have spiritual relationships to plants, but we also have these varied physical relationships with plants. Plants occur as wild plants in our lives, right? Non-cultivated, but then also cultivated plants, food plants, ornamental plants, house plants. If we have a plant in our house, oftentimes it's not a plant that we are necessarily eating or picking, although we can. A lot of times the plants are ornamental, but also they inspire our space, right? Or you can even call them companion plants. They do their own thing, but we don't have to look at them as objects to harvest or eat. So there are different roles of plants for plants in our lives. And so it's important when you look at a literary work to think about those different roles that plants have in our lives. It could be, so in terms of a person impacted by a plant, you could do a phytopoetic reading of a literary work that's about dining, that's about food, the kitchens of many different literary works that are not necessarily totally focused on the plant. But the reality is plants are there whether they're absent or not. Plants are what they call the absent referent, right? Because we absolutely need them in our lives. If the novel is about a city, like a friend group in the city, and they're totally divorced from the plant world, do you think these are people who never been in a wilderness area or farm? They're eating plants as food. They're engaging with plants as tokens of love or tokens of mourning, right? The plants are omnipresent, whether they're present or not. They're the absent reference. And that's because we are so symbiotically connected to plants that their absence is a kind of illusion. They're always present. And that's why you can read any text from a phytopoetic perspective. And I think the same applies for water. You could certainly do a hydropoetic reading of a text that's not ostensibly or not overtly about water. Okay. But then again, on the other side end of the spectrum, we have these works that are overtly about water, overtly about plants. And they're also phytopoetic, hydropoetic. So it's unavoidable because we need plants, we need water. Our literature then therefore reflects that in some way or another, whether it's a conservation text that's overtly about plants or a text that seems totally removed from plants. Those texts are still about plants. They're still about water because as human beings, we can't forego these relationships. Yeah, that's hopefully that answers your question. Thank you.
Okay, wow, thank you so much, Mr. John, for all of the explanations and for the answers. There's so many new knowledge for us too. We're very thankful. Okay, everyone, now that's all for our discussion session with Mr. John. Thank you for all of your participants. And Mr. John, thank you so much for your time for today's webinar. Such an honor to have you here. Before we end our discussion session, I would like to resume our discussion session. John Charles Ryan's Phytopoetics and Hydropoetics in Literary Studies discusses how literature can reflect deeper connections between humans, plants, and water. Phytopoetics has a focal point on the life of plants and their relationship with people, showing how poetry can express the quiet intelligence and wisdom found in nature. It changes our vision from representation to intermediation. Meanwhile, hydropoetics has a focal point on how water, rivers, oceans, and rain shapes human experience and carries memory. Both ideas invite readers to see nature not just as a background, but as something alive that communicates and interacts with us through language and imagination. But it should take a note that not only poetry, but also any kinds of creative expression, such as social, cultural, psychological, or metaphysical. I'm Fairusanum, very thankful and grateful to be your moderator today. Now, we can back to the Master of Ceremony.
Hello everyone, now we come back to end of our event. Before we end today's event, we kindly ask all participants to fill out the attendance form through the barcode display on your screen. Please scan the QR code using your phone's camera or click the link shared in the Zoom chat box. To the operator, please proceed.
Kalau hashtag itu
Okay, everyone. Next, we will have a short documentation session. Please turn on your cameras and smile for take a photo. To the operator, please take the screenshot. Slide 1. 1, 2, 3.
Slide 2. 1, 2, 3.
And next, slide 3. 1, 2, 3.
Slide 4. 1, 2, 3.
Slide 5. 1, 2, 3.
Slide 6. 1, 2, 3.
Slide 7. 1, 2, 3.
Slide 8. 1, 2, 3.
Slide 9. 1, 2, 3.
Slide 10. 1, 2, 3.
Yes, already done. Thank you very much for all of you.
Okay, before we officially end, let's say our slogan once again. When we say hydro and Phyto Poetics, you answer grow with poems, flow with melody. 1, 2, 3.
Hydro and Phyto Poetics, grow with poems, flow with melody.
Okay.
See you again in the next events. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you and see you next time.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to meet you.
Thank you so
Mr.
much,
John.
Mr. John.
Mr. Rocket.
Thank you so much, Pak Jack, Pak Andi. Thank you so much. Terima
Thank you.
kasih. Terima kasih semuanya yang
I
hadir.
see you next time.
Mahasiswa.
Manda and Yasmin and Safir.
John, hope you can join the offline session, perhaps in the next year or in the future.
Oh, yes, yes. I hope so. I hope so.
We are waiting you here in Surabaya.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to come back to see. It's been a while. It's been 5 years. So
Thank you so
see
much.
you in
Thank
person
you.
sometime.